Did you see the news just recently when they interviewed one of the leaders in Saudi Arabia about this attack that had occurred on the American base there, and of course the death of various American servicemen? And they interviewed this fellow, and he was talking about the fact that they were looking for the perpetrators of this, and he said, if we catch them, he says, when we catch them, justice is going to be sure. He says, it's not going to be another O.J. Simpson trial. Well, they don't have those kind of trials in Saudi Arabia, but it goes to show the view of justice, of American justice, that has pervaded the world. The rest of the world has come to certain conclusions in their mind about justice in this country and the way that things are. And it's sort of interesting when you read in the book of Isaiah and in various prophets concerning justice in this land. And it's not something new. It's not something that's just started with the O.J. Simpson trial or started with things of this sort. What we have, of course, seen over the years is that those who are wealthy and who are influential are rarely convicted, and if they are, they're never sentenced to death. Those who are poor, those who are obscure, those who don't have the clout, are frequently convicted of something, and then, of course, there are all sorts of plea bargains and all sorts of things here, there, and yonder that go into all of this. And if any of you have ever been involved in some of these things of civil litigation, woe be if you ever got tied up in some problem with collecting insurance or due to some damage, and you know how long something like that can just drag on and on and on, and it's interesting what God says in the book of Isaiah chapter 5. In verse 7 he says, "For the vineyard of the Eternal of Hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah his pleasant plant. And he looked for judgment, but behold oppression, for righteousness, but behold a cry." So God looked for certain things. He said he looked for judgment, and he looked for righteousness, but he didn't find that. As God looks down on our land and our nation. Coming on down a little further in the book of Isaiah, or in chapter 5, on down to verse 20, God says, "Woe to them that call evil good, and good evil, that put darkness for light and light for darkness, that put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Woe to them that are wise in their own eyes and prudent in their own sight. Woe to them that are mighty to drink wine and men of strength to mingle strong drink, which justify the wicked for reward and take away the righteousness of the righteous from him." God says there's an upside down situation. He said there are those who call evil good and good evil. Very interesting. There was an article back several years ago, an interview with Alan Dershowitz, who was a professor of law at Harvard University. And they were interviewing him on the U.S. legal system. And he made the point, he said, look, when we go into the courtroom, he said, we're not on a quest for truth. We're there to win a case. He said, it's an adversarial system. He said, one lawyer does everything he can to win his case, and the other does everything he can to win his case. And he very openly admitted, he said, we're not there looking for truth. He said, usually both attorneys have some aspects of truth they're trying to cover up. He said, the defense attorney has truth that he doesn't want to come out. And he said, usually the prosecutor has truth he doesn't want to come out. And he said, we're both there. And he just openly admitted this. And this was a man who's a professor at Harvard Law School. This is the most prestigious law school in the nation. And he openly admitted, we're not looking for truth. We're trying to win our case. It's an adversarial system. And we cover up the things that are detrimental to our case, and they cover up the things that are detrimental to their case. And we have a contest. And of course, if it is an individual who is poor, then he's probably stuck with whoever the court appoints for him. And the fellow that the court appoints, he's not going to make a whole lot of money out of it. He puts in his hours, and he comes in there, and he doesn't have time to cover up a whole lot. He's maybe got a lot of different things that he's doing. If someone is very wealthy and influential, they can hire a whole raft of attorneys, and what one of them can't think of, the other one can. And they get in. They call evil good and good evil. Noticed on the religion page of the Baton Rouge Advocate today, the Presbyterians are debating over ordaining homosexuals. And they had a close vote on it. They decided that they would ordain them if they were not currently practicing their homosexuality. They would ordain them. So they're really coming down, strong for the Scriptures, right? Woe to them that call evil good and good evil. They get things all twisted up. They get things upside down. God says, as He looks at the nation, He looks for judgment. He looks for righteousness. And what He sees is an upside down system. He sees those that justify the wicked for reward and take away the righteousness of the righteous from Him. They're not on a quest for truth as God indicts the system of justice in this land. And there's no verse in the Bible that better personifies the state of what we have that exists so frequently in this country today than right here in Isaiah 5:23. We find that there's so many who are willing to justify the wicked for reward. You pay them enough, and they'll get in there and try to get the axe murderer off. They'll do their best. Maybe hack 15 people to death, and they'll get in there. If he has enough money, he can hire hotshot lawyers that'll try every trick in the book to try to get this poor, misunderstood fella off. And I think when he gets off, he ought to have to go live with them for a while. They might not be so quick to want to get him off if he had to live in the next bedroom or something. But they justify the wicked for reward. They're for sale. They'll go all out no matter what was involved, if there's enough in it for them, and take away the righteousness of the righteous from him. Willing to, it doesn't matter if you're right, whether it's a civil case or a criminal case. There's so many who, again, have this approach so many times, and a lot of you are personally familiar with situations where it was obvious that the primary quest was not for the truth of the matter. So frequently both sides are trying to cover up truth. Well, God makes the statement in verse 24, therefore as the fire devours the stubble and the flame consumes the chaff, so their root shall be as rottenness, and their blossom shall go up as dust, because they have cast away the law of the eternal hosts, and despised the word of the Holy One of Israel. That's a serious matter. God talks about the importance of righteous judgment. He talks about the importance of truth and equity, of dealing with people in a right and a fair way. Not justifying the wicked for reward and then taking away the righteousness of the righteous from him, taking and seek in the broad places thereof, if you can find a man, if there be any that executes judgment, that seeks the truth, and I'll pardon. And though they say the eternal lives, surely they swear falsely. Isn't that amazing? All these people, they'll swear by the Bible, and they'll take every kind of oath imaginable and just lie, going and coming. Doesn't slow them down. Well, they say the eternal lives, but they swear falsely. It doesn't stop them. Notice back in Isaiah 59. Isaiah 59, verse 4. None calls for justice, nor any pleads for truth. They trust in vanity and speak lies. They conceive mischief and bring forth iniquity. Very descriptive of public discourse in this country, whether it's in the courts of law, whether it's among the politicians, they're not really after what's right and what's true. They trust in vanity. They put together all of these contrived things. They have their publicity campaigns, and they try to sway public opinion, and they hire all of these opinion polling services to sort of find out what's going to appeal to people, what's going to turn people off. They get all of these public relations individuals involved, and they're not out looking for truth and for justice. They trust in vanity. They speak lies. They conceive mischief and bring forth iniquity. They hatch cockatrice eggs and weave the spider's web. He that eats their eggs dies. That which is crushed breaks out into a viper. Their web shall not become garments, neither shall they cover themselves with their works. Their works are works of iniquity, and the act of violence is in their hand. Their feet run to evil, and they make haste to shed innocent blood. Their thoughts are thoughts of iniquity. Wasting and destruction are in their paths. The way of peace they know not, and there is no judgment in their goings. They've made them crooked paths. Whosoever goes therein shall not know peace. Therefore is judgment far from us, neither does justice overtake us. We wait for light, but behold obscurity, for brightness, but walk in darkness. Now, that's a pretty good description of the court system. We wait for light, but behold obscurity. I tell you, you can think something that's plain and simple. We go in there, and by the time they finish fogging the issue, you can't tell, you can't see through it. You can't see which end is up. You know, we look for brightness, but we walk in darkness. That's the state of things, because there's not a quest for truth. Now, God says in verse 10, we grope for the wall like the blind. We grope as if we had no eyes. We stumble at noonday as in the night. We're in desolate places as dead men. It's a pretty horrible description. On down in verse 14, judgment is turned away backward, justice stands afar off, truth is fallen in the street, equity cannot enter. What's right? What's fair? You know, what's politically correct? What's politically expedient? What is, who's got the most money? Who's got the best public relations? Who can sort of sway and influence? Yea, truth fails. He that departs from evil makes himself a prey. The Lord saw it, and it displeased Him that there was no judgment. You know, you depart from evil, you try to be right, you try to be honest and above board and deal as you ought, and you make yourself a prey. There are those who are there, they're ready to pick on somebody that's trying to be honest and truthful. It displeased God that there was no judgment. He saw that there was no man, and He wondered that there was no intercessor. Therefore His arm brought salvation unto Him, and His righteousness it sustained Him. He put on righteousness as a breastplate and a helmet of salvation upon His head. He put on the garments of vengeance for clothing, was clad with zeal as a cloak. According to their deeds, according will He repay. Fury for His adversaries, recompense to His enemies. To the islands He will repay recompense. So they shall fear the name of the Eternal from the west, and His glory from the rising of the sun. When the enemy shall come in like a flood, the Spirit of the Eternal shall lift up a standard against him. The Redeemer shall come to Zion, and unto them that turn from transgression in Jacob, says the Eternal. There is a time of judgment coming. Jesus Christ is going to return in power and glory. We're told in the book of Malachi, in chapter 3, verse 1, Behold, I will send my messenger. And this was fulfilled, as we could see. We're not going to go into all the details of it, but John the Baptist came as a messenger. Behold, I send my messenger, and he shall prepare the way before me. And the Lord whom you seek shall suddenly come to His temple, even the messenger of the covenant, whom you delight in. Behold, he shall come, says the Lord of hosts. Now, Jesus Christ came as the messenger of the covenant. He came with the gospel of the kingdom of God. There was a messenger that prepared the way, and he came to the temple. You know, Haggai had prophesied that the glory of the latter house would be greater than the glory of the former. Now, when you go back and you read the story in Haggai and you read it in Ezra and Nehemiah, it's very plain that the physical glory of the first temple far exceeded the physical glory of the second temple. It was the temple that Solomon built was larger, grander, had more gold and jewels and all of these things, far outshone the temple that Zerubbabel built and that Herod enlarged. The temple that Solomon built, the glory of the Lord filled the temple and came in like a cloud, and the priest couldn't even enter in for the glory of the Lord. That was very impressive. Nothing similar happened at the dedication of the second temple. But Haggai made a prophecy. He said that the glory of this latter house will far exceed the glory of the former, because the desire of all nations shall come. You see, the glory of the second temple exceeded the glory of the first because the one to whom the temple was dedicated, Jesus Christ, the God of Israel, came in the flesh and stood in that temple. You can read in the book of John, what did he do? He cast out the money changers when he came in. Now, Christ came the first time as the messenger of the covenant, but He's going to come again. And just as there was a messenger to prepare the way before Him the first time, so the way is prepared before Him the second time. I think we understand that God, way back decades ago, raised up Mr. Armstrong, and through him, the work of God, of which we are a continuation, with a primary purpose of preparing the way for the return of Jesus Christ by proclaiming His message. And He's going to suddenly come. Verse 2 of Malachi 3, who shall abide? Who may abide the day of His coming? Who shall stand when He appears? For He's like a refiner's fire and like fuller's soap. He shall sit as a refiner and purifier of silver. He'll purify the sons of Levi and purge them as gold and silver, that they may offer unto the eternal an offering in righteousness. Then shall the offering of Judah and Jerusalem be pleasant unto the Lord, as in the days of old and as in former years. And I will come near to you to judgment. This is on in the future. And I will be a swift witness against the sorcerers. Now it's interesting, that phrase in the Hebrew language, that term, is a term that literally means, comes from a root word that means to shred, and it means one who shreds drugs into a potion. This would refer to the drug dealers and the purveyors of drugs, all of that sort of thing. That would be I think, more the sense of the word, as it would apply to what Christ is going to deal with when He comes back. I'll be a swift witness against the sorcerers, against all of the drug dealers, against the adulterers, and against the false swearers, and against those that oppress the hireling in his wages, take advantage of people and try to cheat. The widow, the fatherless, and they that turn aside the stranger from his right, and fear not me, says the Eternal of hosts. Those who have a bully mentality. Who do the bullies take advantage of? Well, they take advantage of the ones that can't strike back. Can't, whether it's taking advantage of those who maybe can't speak the language, who are not politically connected, who don't have the wealth and the clout. Take advantage of widows, of orphans, of employees, of anyone that is under their control, anyone that can't somehow fight back. Christ said, there is a day of reckoning coming. Judgment involves the way that we handle all of our responsibilities. There is a day of reckoning. And there are those, Christ is coming near to judgment. And there is a reckoning for the things that take place, for all of the horrible things that that go on and that have gone on. You know, it's interesting, back in, I mentioned here the sorcerers or the drug dealers back in Nahum chapter 3. There's a reference here in Nahum 3, verse 4. It talks about, in verse 1, the bloody city. In verse 4, because of the multitude of her whoredoms of the well-favored harlot. You can go back to Revelation 17:1 for who that is. The mistress of witchcrafts, and that sells the nations through her whoredoms and families through her witchcrafts. The term witchcrafts here is the same term that was used for sorcerers back there. It means literally the concocting of drugs and potions. The mistress of all these drugs and potions that sells nations through her whoredoms, through all of her illicit relationships, and families. Families. What's destroying families in a very real sense? And families through all of her concocting of drugs and potions. God says, I'm against you. And He talks about the things that are going to happen. I'll tell you, when all things come out, Christ said there's nothing hidden that shall not be revealed, and when everything comes to the fore, I think people are going to be absolutely shocked and amazed to find out all of the skullduggery that has gone on. But you know what? Christ is coming near to judgment. We live in a world that's upside down. A world where justice is all too frequently for sale. Where those who are the real masterminds escape, and if there's a great hue and cry to punish someone, it's the fellow low down on the list that gets caught. Well, there are a lot of things that you and I can't fully know and realize yet. But Christ is coming near to judgment. In Isaiah chapter 32, Isaiah 32 verse 1, we read, Behold, a king shall reign in righteousness, and princes shall rule in judgment. There's a time when a king will reign in righteousness, and guess what? There are going to be those who assist him, princes who will rule in judgment. There's a time coming when justice won't be perverted, when it won't be a matter of how much money you have or who you know, how you're connected. It won't be a matter of where nations and families are wrecked through something like an international drug trade that involves individuals from very high reaches of power and wealth all the way down to the junkie in the street. But it seems that so frequently it's the lowest on the ladder that the attention is turned to. When Christ comes back, He's going to deal with these problems, and He's going to deal with them at the source, and He's going to be assisted by princes who will reign in judgment. The book of Revelation, chapter 20. The book of Revelation, chapter 20, verse 4. John writes, I saw thrones, and they that sat upon them, and judgment was given unto them. And I saw the souls of them that were beheaded for the witness of Jesus and for the word of God, which had not worshipped the beast, neither his image, neither had received his mark upon their foreheads or in their hands. And they lived and reigned with Christ 1,000 years. The rest of the dead lived not again until the 1,000 years were finished. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy is he that has part in the first resurrection. On such the second death has no power, but they shall be priests of God and of Christ, and shall reign with him 1,000 years. I saw thrones, John said. I saw those that sat on them, and judgment was given unto them. Do the miscarriages of justice, do the inequities, does the perverseness, does it bother you? Does it maybe make your blood boil a little bit sometimes? There is going to be a time of reckoning. And if we prepare ourselves, we are called to be there with Jesus Christ as a part of solving the problem. Who are those princes who will reign in judgment? Who are those who will sit upon the thrones to whom judgment will be given? What does God say about the qualification of judges? Are you and I, are we really qualified to sit on those thrones? To do those things? Notice in 2 Chronicles 19, 2 Chronicles 19, we find King Jehoshaphat, who was a good king of Judah, that in verse 4 of 2 Chronicles 19, we find that Jehoshaphat dwelt at Jerusalem, and he went out again through the people from Beersheba to Mount Ephraim. And he brought them back unto the eternal God of their fathers, and he set judges in the land through all the fenced cities of Judah, city by city. And here's what he told the judges. Take heed what you do, for you judge not for man, but for the Eternal who is with you in judgment. Wherefore now let the fear of the Eternal be upon you. Take heed and do it. There is no iniquity with the Lord our God, nor respect of persons, nor taking of gifts. Moreover, in Jerusalem did Jehoshaphat set the Levites and of the Levites and of the priests and of the chief of the fathers of Israel for the judgment of the Eternal for controversies when they returned to Jerusalem. He charged them, saying, Thus shall you do in the fear of the Eternal, faithfully and with a perfect heart. What cause soever shall come to you of your brethren that dwell in their cities, between blood and blood, between law and commandment, statutes and judgments, you shall even warn them that they trespass not against the Eternal, and so wrath come upon you and upon your brethren. This do, and you shall not trespass. Now, he told them, in the end of verse 11, he said, Deal courageously. Deal courageously, and the Eternal shall be with the good. Now, here was Jehoshaphat, who was a king of Judah, and he was setting human beings, Levites, priests, and various of the leaders of the clans of Israel, in positions of judgment in a physical nation. And he emphasized to them to think about what you're doing, because what you're doing is not just on the human level. You're answerable to God. You're to make judgment in the fear of God. There's no iniquity with God. There's no respect of persons. Now, the term respect of persons doesn't mean that you don't show courtesy and respect and kindness to others. What it means is that you don't show favoritism in a wrong sense. That because somebody is rich, because somebody has this position or that influence, that you don't deal in an inequitable way, that you don't have two standards. One standard for the rich and another standard for the poor. What's right is right, what's fair is fair. And so God emphasizes that. Not to be respect of persons or taking of gifts. And we see that sort of thing. You know, he's talking about the bribery, the fact of people being influenced. So when we look at qualifications for a judge, we find that there is the fear of God, there is courage, there is a sense of fairness, not showing respect of persons. We various places back in Ezekiel 44. Ezekiel 44:23, it says, speaking of the priests, They shall teach my people the difference between the holy and profane. Cause them to discern between the unclean and the clean. And in controversy they shall stand in judgment. And they shall judge it according to my judgments. They shall keep my laws and my statutes in all my assemblies. They shall hallow my Sabbaths. They were to teach. The judging involved teaching as well as making decisions. It involved teaching people to make judgments in their own lives, to discern between clean and unclean, holy and profane, to make proper distinctions in the choices that were to be made. That's pretty important, to learn how to make proper distinctions, to learn to make proper choices. You and I have a chance to do that every day. Because every day we make choices in our lives, from the time we get up to the time we go to bed. Are we learning to discern? It just means to choose between the clean and the unclean, to distinguish between what's holy and what's profane. And God says that the priests were to stand in judgment of controversies that arose, but they were to make those judgments not on the basis of who they liked best or who was their buddy or who offered the money, but they were to make it on the basis of God's law, of His statutes and His judgments, the way that the law was to be applied. Notice back in Exodus 18, notice the instructions that Moses recorded here when judges were selected in ancient Israel. Now, Moses' father-in-law was giving him some advice. Notice what he said here in Exodus chapter 18, verse 19. Hearken now unto my voice, and I will give you counsel, and God shall be with you. Behold, be you for the people to Godward, that you may bring the causes unto God. And you shall teach the judges, ordinances and laws, and shall show them the way wherein they must walk and the work that they must do. You'll provide out of all the people able men, such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness. And place such over them to be rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, rulers of 50s, rulers of 10s. Let them judge the people at all seasons, and every great matter they shall bring to you. Every matter small matter they shall judge. Now, we find here a system that God set up in ancient Israel, and undoubtedly this is going to, as God organizes in the world ahead of us, the world that is to come, when Christ comes back and a king shall reign in righteousness and princes shall rule in judgment, undoubtedly it'll be a similar situation. There are gradations of ability and experience. But notice all of the judges, whether they were over 10s, 50s, hundreds, or thousands, they were to be men such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness. If we're going to rule in judgment, if we're going to have judgment given unto us, then we certainly have to be individuals who stand in awe and reverence of God. We're more impressed with God than anything, anyone, anywhere. We're more impressed with God than anyone or anything. Individuals of truth. Individuals to whom the truth matters most. Hating covetousness. Hating covetousness. Not having an attitude of being for sale or allowing ourselves to be blinded in our sense of what's right and fair by money or promise of reward, whatever kind. Individuals who stand for something. In Deuteronomy chapter 1 and verse 16, Moses writes, And I charged your judges at that time, saying, Hear the causes between your brethren, and judge righteously between every man and his brother, and the stranger that is with you. See, regardless whether it was an Israelite or whether it was a stranger, you're to judge righteously. You are to deal fairly. What's right is right. You shall not respect persons in judgment. Verse 17, you shall hear the small as well as the great. You shall not be afraid of the face of man, for the judgment is God's. And the cause that is too hard for you, bring it unto me, and I'll hear it. Individuals of courage. Individuals of truth. Individuals of integrity. Individuals versed in the law of God, the principles of God. Because any decision you're going to make, you have to have a criteria for making it. Any choice you're going to make, you have to have some basis. And the law of God is given to us as our basis. Notice on in John chapter 7, verse 24. Jesus said, Judge not according to the appearance, but judge righteous judgment. Judge not according to the appearance. Don't jump to conclusions. Don't jump to conclusions. Judge righteous judgment. Now, you know, jumping to conclusions is the main... I've known people that was their main exercise. Some people jump rope for exercise. Other people jump to conclusions. And they jump from one conclusion to the other. They judge according to the appearance. They're quick to form an opinion based on impression, based on the way something is presented up front. They're quick to jump to a conclusion. Jesus Christ said, judge righteous judgment. Righteous judgment, not just based on the way things may first appear to be. Now, we're going to look a little further at that, as he tells us, Psalm 119, verse 172 says, all your commandments are righteousness. Righteous judgment is what is right and fair. It is based on God's law. Righteous judgment involves the heart. You see, in Isaiah chapter 11, we have described how this is going to take place. Isaiah chapter 11, verse 1, there shall come forth a rod out of the stem of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots. And the Spirit of the Eternal shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge, and of the fear of the Eternal. So we find what is going to be involved here. God's Spirit. The Spirit that imparts the mind of God, that leads into wisdom, understanding, counsel, might, knowledge, the fear of God. Wisdom and understanding are pretty important. See, wisdom involves knowing how to apply God's law in all sorts of everyday circumstances. Understanding, the commandment says, pick one, thou shalt not steal. Understanding means that you understand what that means. What does stealing involve? Knowledge means that you can recite out, thou shalt not steal. A little child, you can teach a little child before they're ever in school, and they can memorize the 10 Commandments, but they may not understand what some of them mean. But they can recite the words. They have knowledge. Understanding moves beyond knowledge, where you know what it says, and not only do you know what it says, but you understand what it means. You understand what stealing is, and that God doesn't want you to do it. Wisdom means you know how to apply that understanding in daily circumstances. You know how to apply that in a variety of ways in your life. So we need wisdom and we need understanding. We need to know how. We need to know what something means, what the law means, and we need to know how it is to apply in our lives. The Spirit of counsel and might. The Spirit of knowledge and of the fear of the Eternal. To make him of quick understanding in the fear of the Lord. He shall not judge after the sight of the eyes, neither reprove after the hearing of his ears. He's not going to jump to conclusions. You ever had somebody come and tell you their side of the story? And when you finished, boy, you knew they were right. And you were upset. And then a little while later, maybe a day or a week or a month, you found out the rest of the story. And all of a sudden, it wasn't quite like you had thought. It reminds me of an old comedy routine that I saw years ago. And it struck me as funny. These two fellows were having an argument. They had a dispute, and they were going to go to their buddy, the lawyer, and he was going to be the arbitrator. And so they came, and the first one presented his case, and as soon as he finished, the lawyer hammered down with his gavel, and he made his decision and decided in favor of the first fellow. Well, the second one got upset, and he said, "Wait a minute." He said, "You haven't heard my side of the story yet. How can you make up your mind? How can you make a judgment? You haven't only heard one side of the story." And the lawyer said, "Look," he said, "in my years of experience as an arbitrator, I've always found that if I only hear one side of the story, I don't have any trouble making up my mind. When I hear the other side of the story, it gets confusing. And I have trouble deciding who's right and who's wrong. So, I just listen to one side of the story and make up my mind. I don't have any trouble with that. Well, that's the way sometimes people do. Christ isn't going to do that way. He'll have quick understanding of the fear of God. He won't judge after the sight of his eyes. He won't just depend on even what he sees. Won't just jump to conclusions with first impressions. Neither reprove after the hearing of his ears, as word sort of gets to him and he hears about this and he hears about that. He's not going to jump to conclusions. But with righteousness shall he judge the poor, and reprove with equity for the meek of the earth. He'll smite the earth with the rod of his mouth and with the breath of his lips, and he'll slay the wicked. And righteousness shall be the girdle of his loins, and faithfulness the girdle of his reins. It'll be a time of peace. It'll be a time when the wolf will dwell with the lamb, the leopard will lie down with the kid, and the calf and the young lion and the fatling together, and a little child shall lead them. A time, as it describes in verse 9, when they will not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea. And in that day there shall be a root of Jesse, which shall stand for an ensign of the people, and to it shall the Gentiles seek, and his rest shall be glorious. A time of peace, a time of rest, and yet we read in Revelation 20, that I saw thrones, and they that sat on them, and judgment was given unto them. Brethren, do we understand what we're called to do? That we're called to share in judgment? God is developing His character in us, that we might be entrusted with responsibility under Jesus Christ to rightly apply God's principles. Now, how do we prepare for that? Well, among other things, we have to learn what to avoid. It tells us in Matthew chapter 7. See, what kind of judges does God not want? Matthew chapter 7, beginning in verse 1. It says, Judge not, that you be not judged. With what judgment you judge, you shall be judged, and with what measure you mete it, shall be measured to you again. Why behold you the mote that's in your brother's eye, and consider not the beam that's in your own eye? How will you say to your brother, let me pull the mote out of your eye, behold the beam that's in your own eye? You hypocrite! First cast the beam out of your own eye, and then you'll see clearly how to cast the mote out of your brother's eye. Now, what are we told here? Well, we're given some instructions about judgment. How are we preparing to judge? Well, one thing, he says, don't be a hypocrite. God doesn't want any hypocritical judges. He says, what does he mean when he says, judge not that you be not judged in Matthew 7:1? The word judge here is used, the term that's used is a term that means to condemn. Don't have a condemning, self-righteous, hypocritical attitude. The Pharisees were quick to judgment. They were quick to judgment, and they took exception with Jesus Christ and all kinds of things that He said and did. They were quick to form impressions, and yet they were condemning in their attitude. They were condemning, they were unforgiving, they were hypocritical. They were quick to spot the flaws in others, and yet they couldn't see themselves. You remember how quickly they would down out of the tree, and he was all excited for Jesus and the disciples, and he told him, he said, look, he said, I know that I have not been an honest person. He had been a tax collector, and he had been one who had abused his power. And he said, I want you to know, he said, I'm going to take immediately, I'm going to take half of what I have, and I'm going to distribute it to the poor and people that I cheated. I'm going to restore to them what I have cheated. What I've taken that I shouldn't have, I'm going to restore fourfold. Now this was the man's heart. This was his attitude. Had he been corrupt? Yes, he had. But he was repentant, and he evidenced that repentance by specific actions that he was ready to take. You see, Christ could look at his heart. He knew the man's attitude. And the man responded to him, told him what he was going to do. You know what? The Pharisees condemned him. He said, why? This man's going to eat with a sinner. He's going to eat with a sinner. He obviously is not a prophet. Well, going to eat with a sinner as though none of them were sinners? Evidently they didn't think they were. They were very quick to jump to conclusions to assume that because this man had done those things in the past that obviously he was going to continue on. They were very quick to find fault with him, but they couldn't find any fault with themselves. Christ told the Pharisees they were hypocrites. They were quick to condemn others, but they didn't see themselves as they were. You know, if we're going to rule in judgment with Christ, we're going to have to be the opposite of the Pharisees. Not having a condemning, self-righteous, hypocritical attitude, but having the attitude that Jesus Christ exemplifies. Notice what it says back in James chapter 2. In James chapter 2, verse 1, my brethren, have not the faith of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory, with respect to persons. Don't have an attitude of showing favoritism. He talked about somebody coming in who was dressed very richly, a very wealthy individual, obvious by his appearance that here was an individual of great prominence and wealth, and someone else came in, and obviously someone who was very poor and poverty-stricken. And if all of a sudden you're giving great deference and trying to curry favor with the rich person and ignoring the person who is poor, you've already made a decision based purely on outward appearance. This isn't saying that we shouldn't try to do the best that we can and be neat and clean and all of that. It's talking about judging the moral worth and value of people based on what they have, based on the kind of car they drive, based on the outward trappings. Those things don't reflect inner worth and value. Is that the way God judges? Does God just sort of look down and he sees somebody and makes up his mind about the worth and the value of that person based on the outer trappings? And if we're learning to be like God, we're not going to be doing that either. No, he tells us in verse 8, if you fulfill the royal law according to the Scriptures, you'll love your neighbor as yourself. You do well. If you have respect of persons, you treat people differently based on this sort of thing. You commit sin and are convicted of the law as transgressors. If you take advantage of someone because they are poor, if you would give favoritism, if you would show favoritism based on outward factors. No, whosoever, verse 10, shall keep the whole law and yet offend in one point is guilty of all. Jesus said, don't commit adultery. He said, also don't kill. If you commit no adultery, yet if you kill, you'll become a transgressor of the law. So speak you and so do you, as one that shall be judged by the law of liberty. He shall have judgment without mercy that has showed no mercy, and mercy rejoices against judgment. What do we want? Do we want mercy? I saw a sign up recently, I think on this last trip. It said, said, may you receive, how was it worded? May you receive mercy, may you receive the same kind of mercy you have shown to us. May you receive the same kind of mercy you have shown to us. That's a pretty biblical statement. If you go back to what Christ said in the Sermon on the Mount, he said, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. So, mercy is a pretty important part of judgment. And it involves then acting, doing what we can, acting on what we say. Faith without works is dead. You see someone destitute, and all you say is you part in peace, and yet you're in a position to help them, then you need to see that. Notice what Christ said back in John chapter 5. John chapter 5 and verse 19. The woman said unto, no, it's not 4, John. Okay. Then answered Jesus and said unto them, Truly I say unto you, the Son can do nothing of himself, but what he sees the Father do. For what things soever he does, these also does the Son likewise. As the Father loved the Son and showed him all things that himself does, he will show him greater works than these, and they shall marvel. The Father raised up the dead and quickens whom he will, even so the Son quickens whom he will. For the Father judges no man, but has committed all judgment unto the Son. You see, Jesus Christ came as a human being, and he lived life as a human being. He was tempted in all points like as we are, yet without sin. Paul tells us in Hebrews that Christ learned by the things that he suffered. He understands what it's like to be a human being. God has entrusted judgment to Jesus Christ, because Jesus Christ understands firsthand what it's like to be a human being. Jesus Christ said in verse 30, I can of my own self do nothing. As I hear, I judge, and my judgment is just, because I seek not my own will, but the will of the Father, which is heaven. Christ came to apply the Father's will, and his judgments were based on what the Father instructed. The Father instructed in the way of righteousness. So, what are we to avoid? We're to avoid the kind of hypocritical jumping to conclusions that characterized the Pharisees, the kind of quickness to condemn, of seeing faults in others and yet not seeing ourselves. That's not preparing us for the kind of judgment God wants judged. But we are to learn righteous judgment. Now, let's go on. Let's look a little further at see what we're to learn back here in 1 Corinthians 11. If we're not to have this sort of condemning, hypocritical attitude, being quick to jump to conclusions and fault find in others, what are we to do? 1 Corinthians 11, verse 31, tells us, For if we would judge ourselves, we should not be judged. When we are judged, we're chastened of the Lord, that we should not be condemned with the world. Now, notice here, three levels. If we would judge ourselves, the starting point is for us to look at ourselves. In the book of James, God's law is called the perfect law of liberty, and we're told that the analogy is given of those who would look into a mirror and see something wrong and yet not change it, not make any alteration. Straightway go their way and forget what they saw. And compared to those who look into God's law, pictured or described as a mirror, and use it as a basis of making proper change and alteration. If we study God's Word, and we see God's perfect way reflected, and we recognize that we don't perfectly reflect what we read in this book. See, if we would judge ourselves, we wouldn't have to be judged. God gives us first an opportunity to change. He gives us an opportunity to make changes in our lives, and if we don't, then God begins to deal with us to get our attention and to bring things to our attention, and He does that. He chastens us, verse 32, so that we're not condemned with the world. You see, there are three levels. The best level is to judge yourself, to study the Scriptures and seek to apply the principles of God and to seek to make changes in your life to be in conformity with the Scriptures. And if you, where we're negligent of that, God takes. God works with us through circumstances to bring things to our attention and to sort of make us sit up and take notice. And He does that out of mercy, but He doesn't want us to have to go through the calamities that are to come. So, we are to learn in terms of judgment, beginning with ourselves. You know, it seems people want to start practicing on others. And Christ said, start with yourself. Start with yourself, and when you get it down pretty good with yourself, then maybe you'll be in a position to do something with others. Talked about in Romans chapter 14 about those who are weak in faith. Romans 14:1, you're to receive, not to doubtful disputation. So there were matters that there was an issue here had to do with eating food. Meat that was commonly available in Rome had a large portion of it had come from the slaughter of animals at various temples. Much of it had been involved in idolatrous offerings and was then offered for sale in the meat market. And there were those who simply avoided all meat because they couldn't be sure that the meat they were eating had not been offered in sacrifice to an idol. And so they simply ate vegetables. There were others who felt like that, well, they weren't going to the idol temple, they weren't seeking idolatrous meat, they didn't know for sure that it wasn't an issue with them, the meat hadn't been hurt. So it was an issue of faith, an issue of understanding, an issue of where you draw the line. There's some things that they all clearly agreed on. You don't go down there and worship the idol. But what about buying meat in the market? It was an issue of disagreement. And you know what? People had gotten into arguments and they were judging one another. Some considered others, some considered certain ones to be self-righteous. Others considered the ones that wouldn't eat it were undoubtedly called self-righteous, and the ones that were known to eat meat were considered as though they were somehow compromisers with idolatry. Paul said in Romans 14:4, "Who are you that judges another man's servant? To his own master he stands or falls." People were so busy tending to one another's business they didn't have time left over to tend to their own. They were quick to judge and to condemn those who didn't draw the lines exactly as they drew them. In areas of judgment and applications of the principles of God's law. We're not talking about individuals who were flagrantly breaking the law. We're talking about people who were applying the principles. Seeking to, they were applying them a little different way. There was a difference of agreement, a difference of opinion among some of them. It involved days of eating and not eating. The Pharisees had a practice, a custom, a tradition of fasting twice in the week. And they made a custom of it. There were those who, they made a practice on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And they had those days set aside, and they did that as a regular matter, not necessarily a full fast, but at least going 12 hours there during the giving up certain foods on those days. They had slight variations in the way they did it, but they set aside certain days, and they had their various reasons for that. And some esteemed one day above another, and others esteemed every day alike. They would eat or not eat, depending on whether they made the choice, but not viewing this as being in a particular way. Now, the issue had to do with some of these practices and the fact that people were spending their time judging one another and fault finding.
Paul tells us, look, in verse 7, none of us lives to himself, and no man dies to himself. Whether we live to the Lord. Whether we die to the Lord. Whether we live, therefore, or die, we're the Lord. So, verse 10, why do you judge your brother? Why do you set at naught your brother? For we shall all stand before the judgment seat of Christ. We're told in verse 12, let every one of us shall give account of himself to God. Let us not therefore judge one another anymore, but judge this rather, that no man put a stumbling block or an occasion to fall in his brother's way. Now, verse 14, I'm persuaded that there's nothing unclean. If you notice in the margin, if your margin has, my margin has a little number 2 out by the word unclean, and in the margin it says common. There's 2 terms, common and unclean. You remember when Peter saw the vision in Acts 10, he said, not so, Lord, I've never eaten anything common or unclean. Common had to do with food that was clean, but was not kosher. It had not been slaughtered according to ritual tradition, or it had been contaminated by having been involved in idolatry. And Paul said, I'm persuaded there's nothing common of itself. That's the term that's used here, not unclean. You see, some of these things that were matters of ritual and tradition were not contaminated, but people were arguing about it. They were judging one another in terms of exactly how they drew the line. The law of God said don't commit idolatry. In terms of people set up their own arbitrary lines, and we all do. And you have to set up some sort of line. In every area of your life, you make decisions. And you make choices of what you choose to do and what you choose not to do. The law is clear. But exactly how we apply every specific thing, some may watch one movie and someone else may say, well, I don't think I want to watch that. I don't want my kids watching that. And I dare say that we don't all draw the line at exactly the same spot. The point is that our emphasis is not in looking around making sure that everybody else is meeting exactly our line. What we need to be concerned about is that we need to judge this, that we're not putting a stumbling block in front of someone else. We're not doing something that could maybe cause offense and stumbling to others. There may be things you ought to deny yourself, even though you may not see that there's anything wrong with it, but you can see that others would maybe be hurt or offended or bothered by it, and so you simply would decline to do that, knowing that represents the problem. That there's an attitude of consideration for others. If you know someone has had a problem with alcohol and they don't drink, and you may know, well, the Bible doesn't condemn drinking, but maybe they've chosen not to drink. Maybe they've had a problem in times past, and they realize that the best thing for them to do is leave it totally alone. What are you going to do? Pour a glass, sort of wave it around under their nose and say, this stuff's pretty good, too bad you can't have some. Well, that would not be, that's the kind of thing Paul is talking about. You're going to put a stumbling block? Oh, go ahead. You're going to put a stumbling block in front of others? No, what we need to be concerned about is that we're setting a right example and that we are trying to walk before God in sincerity and truth. We are to use God's law to judge ourselves in the sense of looking into it as a mirror, as the perfect law of liberty. But we recognize that ultimate judgment is God's. Paul had a problem in the Corinthian church. There were people in Corinth judging Paul. They were nitpicking and criticizing and fault-finding. And Paul told them in 1 Corinthians 4:1, he said, let a man so account of us as of the ministers of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God. Moreover, it's required in stewards that a man be found faithful. That's the primary requirement. Paul understood that, and he told them, he said, I know that. I know that I'm a steward of God, and I'm responsible to be faithful to God. Verse 3, with me, it's a very small thing that I should be judged of you or of a man's judgment. Yes, I judge not my own self. In other words, my conscience isn't even my God. I know nothing of myself. By myself, I can't make that decision. But I'm not hereby justified. He that judges me is the Lord. Therefore judge nothing before the time, until the Lord comes, who both will bring to light the hidden things of darkness and will make manifest the counsels of the heart. He said, don't get so busy that you're trying to make all these decisions now. You know, people like to pigeonhole others and decide motives and attitudes. Does nothing until the time. Ultimately, we give account to God. And when Christ comes, you see, He'll bring to light the hidden things of darkness. And He'll make manifest the counsels of the heart. He'll bring to light the things that are necessary to see for righteous judgment to be judged. So we don't have to jump to conclusions. We have to take stock of ourselves. We are to use God's law as a means of guiding our lives. We're to judge that we don't put a stumbling block before others. We're not to be hypocritical, but we are to learn to practice mercy. We are to walk in our lives in the fear of God. Now, 1 Corinthians 5 dealt with something else. It dealt with a matter of open, flagrant sin. Here wasn't a matter of having to look into the counsels and intents of the heart. Here was a man that was openly living in an incestuous relationship with his stepmother. Now this was a different matter. Paul told them that in verse 3 of 1 Corinthians 5, I truly, as absent in body but present in spirit, have judged already as though I were present concerning him that has done this deed. He told them to deliver such a one, turn him over to Satan, to excommunicate him, to put him out. And there is a judgment that is to be applied. Verse 12, he says, or verse 11, he says, I've written unto you not to keep company if any man that is called a brother be a fornicator, or covetous, or an idolater, or a railer, or drunkard, or an extortioner, with such a one, no, not to eat. Somebody who is involved in an open, flagrant lifestyle that is totally contrary to God's way. Now he said, what have I to do to judge them that are without? But don't you judge those that are within. In other words, if somebody is going to be a part of the fellowship and yet they're going to live a lifestyle where they are immoral, they are conducting themselves in a way that is obviously contrary to Scripture. And you see, this was something that was commonly reported among them. They all knew about it. It wasn't a matter of looking at the intent of the heart. It wasn't a matter of someone who was bringing forth fruits of repentance. It was someone who had a contemptuous attitude toward God's law. He just went out and did what he wanted to do. That was a different matter. There was to be judgment. Verse 13, those that are without God judges, therefore put away from yourselves that wicked person. Someone who was involved in something like that couldn't continue his fellowship in the church. Now, this wasn't a matter where people were going around trying to sort of decide, well, they didn't like somebody's attitude and they didn't think that maybe his motive for this or that. Paul's not talking about that. He's talking about an open way of life, something that was commonly known. Something that was public knowledge, and it needed to be dealt with. Public stand had to be taken. So there is a kind of judgment that is to be applied. Now, in 1 Corinthians 6, Paul goes on a little further about judgment, and he says, dare any of you having a matter against one another, go to law before the unjust and not before the saints. Well, you know the saints are going to judge the world. Are you unworthy to judge the smallest matters? Talking about people, here were people in the church who had a disagreement, and instead of allowing it to be arbitrated by and keep the matter private here, they were going sort of airing their dirty linen in the worldly court. It certainly was a horrible example. Paul said, isn't there someone there who can make a judgment? Verse 5, I speak to your shame. Is there not a wise man among you? No, not one that shall be able to judge between his brethren. Isn't there somebody whose wisdom that you have enough respect for that the two of you are willing to sit down and let the thing be arbitrated? Now therefore, there's utterly a fault among you. One goes to law with another. Why do you not rather take wrong? So here we find a contentious attitude. You see, that's not what we're to have. We're to have an attitude of reconciliation. Well, the point is that judgment is perverted in this present world. Christ is going to come back to judge. A king shall reign in righteousness, princes shall reign in judgment. We are preparing right now to be those princes, to fulfill our destiny and our calling. God's law must be written in our hearts and in our minds. We must be learning to walk with God, to reflect the characteristics that God describes of being lovers of truth, being lovers of mercy, being lovers of righteousness, of having an attitude of fairness and of mercy for all human beings. Not an attitude of playing favorites, but an attitude of trying to do what's right. We need to be practicing not on our neighbors, but on ourselves. Looking not to cast the splinter out of our neighbor's eye, but the beam out of our own. Looking into God's law as into a mirror, the perfect law of living. Learning to apply godly principles in our lives. Learning to recognize that there are things that must wait until Christ returns. Because He will make manifest the counsels of the heart. He will bring to light the hidden things of darkness. But in the meantime, we can judge that we don't put a stumbling block in front of our neighbor. That we are seeking to walk with God in all our ways. And that we are growing in mercy and in the attributes and the character of Jesus Christ. God has called us to judge righteous judgment. We must learn the way of righteousness, truth, and mercy, that we may have a part in administering those ways on which we come.